So 3:30 kickoff, CBS, South Carolina, Georgia. We were just commiserating, much like you and I did yesterday, that these two teams don't play next year, which is just going to be weird, Palmer. And also last time in the foreseeable future that they will be playing each other on CBS as well. So how weird is that to you as well from the Georgia perspective?
It's weird. I mean, having covered this team for a couple of years, actually the first game that I was I wasn't working the game, but I was on the beat that week was that 2018 Georgia South Carolina game. So, I think back to the, Debo Samuel matchup against DeAndre Baker, physical football game there. That was a 3:30 CBS game, a hot one there in Columbia. And, these are two teams, two fan bases that, like to go back and forth a little bit. Obviously, there's a lot of crossover. Georgia having Will Muschamp and Brian McClendon, Mike Bobo spent a little bit of time there in Columbia too. So these, Shane obviously having spent time in Athens, these coaches, these staffs are very, very, very familiar with each other. These fan bases are, and I think it makes for an exciting rivalry.
Palmer, here's where I want to start because this is what we've been talking about for several days now leading up to this game. Let's start with Georgia on offense, right? And so I know we'll dive in deeper to that and kind of put the microscope on Carson Beck in particular, but what have been your thoughts on this Georgia offense through the first two games? Obviously, the competition has not been as significant. A little bit of sloppiness in those two first games offensively, opportunistic, right? You still put up a bunch of points. You still win those games very handily, but is the feeling that Georgia maybe just kind of sleptwalked a little bit, that they're still getting their feet under him, that Carson Beck's still getting his feet under him? Or are there some legitimate questions once Georgia hops into conference play throughout this season? What's your take on that?
Is all of the above a fair answer? Because, sure. You're absolutely right. You preface this kind of a conversation with the Georgia entirely, but the offense specifically with the opponents. They played an FCS opponent in UT Martin. They had a MAC team in Ball State come to town. So what do you take away from that? Not a ton, because I don't think that Mike Bobo in this offense opened it up a ton. I think that Carson Beck was still getting comfortable, but obviously they weren't, they were physically a much more dominant football team than either of the two teams that they played. So, preface the conversation with that. I think that it's important to, keep in mind that Carson Beck is, will be making his third career start. This is going to be his first career SEC start. And so he's still getting comfortable. I think that is an important factor in evaluating this Georgia offense. There's a lot of things that Kirby Smart's come to his defense because the fans, especially after that first game, when it felt like maybe it was a little bit more check down Beck, than pushing the ball down the field. They were at his throat, and Kirby came to his defense and said, look, guys, there's a lot of things that y'all don't understand and you can't understand because you don't see it. It's the run checks. It's identifying the mic and, getting the team in a place where you're not going to mess it up. And so I think that's what he's done really well. That's what this offense entirely has done really well is they haven't messed it up. They put up, 48 points in the first game. They did have a pick six, and 45 points in the second game. They did have a punt return, but, they had great field position with 3 turnovers there from the defense. But this offense has done their job. They have, I said it to Colin earlier this week, Georgia's offense so far has done a really good job. Carson Beck, being at the helm of that, has done a good job of not messing things up. When the pressure gets turned up on them, being the opponents are, the stakes are higher. The opponents are bigger. They're faster. They're stronger. How will they respond? We're going to wait and see on Saturday.
Palmer, let's kind of keep it right there, but shift over a little bit. Offensive line play, running backs. I know Georgia's had some guys banged up there. I was listening and actually watching you guys on DawgsHQ on your YouTube page earlier today, trying to sort of dive into some of the topics in Dog Nation right now. It's kind of funny. Y'all were talking about some of the same things about Georgia's offensive line that we have talked about with South Carolina. But I think you also have to preface that to say there are levels to this. So I think the expectations that Georgia has established and the expectations that fans have, particularly for a Georgia running game that traditionally, you just think of great back after great back. You think of this big, huge physical offensive line. And so when I hear people say, hey guys, the running backs haven't quite been breaking tackles like they need to, offensive line has not been creating holes like they need to me, that's not quite the same as, South Carolina gave up 9 sacks in week 1. So there are levels to this. However, if you're a South Carolina fan and you're kind of trying to create a little path in your head, how could South Carolina possibly pull off an upset? To me, it's got to start with continuing to make Georgia fans feel like they're not creating enough in the running game and trying to put this game on Carson Beck's shoulders and just finding out what happens, kind of answering that question one way or the other for if Beck can lead a team to a win in a key situation. So you've seen a bunch of Georgia football, man. I know it's a very long question, but I felt like all that was important to say. You've seen a lot of Georgia football. So is the running game a little bit of a question right now, like compared to everybody else in the world, or is it a little bit of a question compared to the insanely high expectations that Georgia people are always going to put on a Georgia rushing attack?
Princess problems is what I like to call it. I do think that there is a concern with this run game because, you look at the room and they don't have a guy like DeAndre Swift, who we saw do incredible things on Thursday Night Football last night. They don't have a Nick Chubb, a Sony Michel. They really don't even have a Zamir White or James Cook, two guys that were a 1-2 punch there. Granted, they haven't had Daijun Edwards. He's been banged up. They are completely without Branson Robinson, who was the number 1 or 2 running back in the country for the class of 2022, and he's out for the season. Kendall Milton has been less than 100%. He was a highly touted guy coming out of high school. They don't have the explosive difference maker in that room, and I think that shows. But they've got some guys that are certainly capable of doing it. They just haven't necessarily been out there. Like I said, Daijun Edwards, has not played in those first 2 games. Kendall Milton has been less than 100%, and I don't know if he got a second half snap against UT Martin. Kirby said that he got tightened up a little bit there at halftime, dealing with a hamstring injury. And so that's a battle that, he's had throughout his career and he will continue to have this season. They've got to find ways to keep him warm and keep him involved without over involving him. But because they don't want to risk any more injuries with him. So I think, with that, all that being said, they've got guys capable of doing it. They've got, an offensive line that, like you said, the Georgia fans are so used to having an offensive line full of, future NFL guys. And they have that this year. Cedric Van Pran there in the middle is, a 30 game starter coming into this year. Amarius Mims could be a first round pick next year, in this coming NFL draft there at tackle. The 2 guards, Tate Ratledge and Xavier Truss, are returning starters from last year. Each of them started 14 games last year. They've got depth too. They feel really good about, probably 6, 7, 8 offensive linemen, as you go down that depth chart, and they're not afraid to use 6, 7, 8 offensive linemen. Last year, 7 guys played more than 35% of the snaps for Georgia offensively on that offensive line. And so, I think that it'll be interesting to see these opponents that Georgia has played so far. They've loaded the box. And Wes, you and I talked about this. That's kind of South Carolina's thing. They like to go one high and, put a safety out there on an island and put some more pressure on that run game. It makes sense because you're looking at a first-time starter at quarterback. And, if you're going to get beat, make the first-time starter at quarterback beat you. So it makes sense, but also at the same time, Georgia fans, like you said, probably accustomed to, such great things. Well, last year, Georgia got its run game together. They started slowly, but they figured it out. I did a little bit of a stat dive today. Coming into the South Carolina game last year, through 2 games last year, Georgia fans were, really upset about the run game. They had averaged 129.5 yards per game coming into that. They are once again really upset through 2 games coming into the South Carolina game. They are averaging 129.0. So Georgia, exploded for 208 last year against South Carolina. Could they do that again this week? Absolutely. Certainly interested to see what Daijun Edwards looks like. Is he's likely to make his return? What does Kendall Milton look like as he continues to get healthier? And what can they continue to add? Can they get a push up front? Can some of these other backs that are involved, Roderick Robinson, who's a true freshman, Andrew Paul, who's a redshirt freshman, can those guys, continue to be playmakers for them?
Palmer, some housekeeping items since you started talking about some of the guys that have been banged up. So let's get an injury report. Daijun Edwards.
This could take the rest of the show, Chris.
Yeah, we've
Same
been
here.
there before. Yes, same here. We've been there before and probably there currently. But Daijun Edwards and Kendall Milton, Ladd McConkey, a great wide receiver who's been out, Javon Bullard, who was banged up against Ball State. Give us the rundown and what it all means.
Yeah, I would throw Daijun Edwards and Kendall Milton into the probable category. Kirby said that he expects Daijun to play. Kendall has played. He just hasn't been 100%. So those two guys included on an injury report, but definitely leaning more towards probable. Day-to-day game time decision with Ladd McConkey. He's been dealing with a back injury. And it's something that he's practiced. He's gone through drills. He's been out there. He's been a participant. And then all of a sudden it flares up on him. And it's a little bit tighter than he wants it to be, come Friday night or Saturday morning. And so, they've held him out. Are they going to continue to hold him out? How precautionary was that versus how much did he really need to be held out? And are they going to continue to be precautionary? Javon Bullard also would be in that questionable category, probably leaning more towards doubtful with him. Georgia's defensive MVP in both of the college football playoff games last year. He was their second leading tackler in this opener, got hurt on one of the first or second drives last week, left the game with an ankle injury in that first quarter, came back to the sidelines in street clothes and a boot on his left foot. I would say he's doubtful, but Kirby said that they probably wouldn't know until Wednesday with him, where he was because he didn't practice at all on Monday. And then Tuesday was getting some treatment and working, the kinks out there. So I would lean towards probably not seeing Javon Bullard and Ladd McConkey. Those are two big losses if those guys indeed don't play. But I do think that it's important and it's big for Georgia that they get Daijun Edwards back and that Kendall Milton continues to be a part of this run game.
Palmer, so South Carolina fans have I will say, complicated relationship with Mike Bobo.
So do Georgia fans.
Yes, yeah, so I was going to say, maybe there's some common ground there, right? In a strange way, I don't know, Chris, you tell me, in a strange way, it's actually an even more complicated relationship than with Will Muschamp, I think. Chris he's not agreeing with me. I can tell from that face.
No. I just had not heard that take before, so I'm processing. What do you mean, though? I think I see what you mean, but
okay. Well, first of all, not to take up all of Palmer's time talking about my.
No, I want to hear this take too. I'm
okay. All right. Listen. So first of all, there's always been a sense from South Carolina fans that Bobo will make at least one decision against them where they're saying, thank you. Like, for one, you look at the decision to throw the ball down near the goal line, a game we've talked about this week, 2014 game where South Carolina beats Georgia in Columbia. Georgia throws the ball, I think, on first down, and can't remember if it was first down or third down. I think they tried to throw a screen and ended up getting a penalty. Intentional grounding. Yep. Then they missed the field goal. South Carolina hangs on by the tip of the football and wins that game. Then at Auburn, 4th and 1, his one season at Auburn, Bobo 4th and 1, Tank Bigsby on the sideline. Auburn is backed up in their own territory. They go play action, incomplete pass. It completely changes the game. South Carolina goes on to beat Auburn. The fact that South Carolina's fans were always kind of up and down about Bobo when he was here as a coordinator. I actually thought with what they had, he did a fantastic job giving them a chance, play calling wise. But then you have the element of he basically says he's staying, but then leaves you after Beamer got hired. So, it was to me, Gamecock fans always just have complicated. It's the best way to say it. And I know Georgia fans, for very different reasons, have a complicated relationship as well. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Palmer, but I was going to ask about the scheme. I know they probably haven't shown much through 2 games at all, but it actually feels very much to me, just from a big picture standpoint, as being similar to what they were doing under Monken, as opposed to being like some new or old Bobo scheme, basically.
No, 100% there. And that was something that Kirby made clear from the moment that Mike Bobo took the job. I think he understands that complicated relationship that Georgia fans have with Mike Bobo. And so he wanted to make it clear, look, we're running a Georgia system now. This is, in the same way that Alabama, after they lost their first couple of coordinators there, had made those offensive changes. And it was like, are they going to go back to what they were, early on, when it was ground and pound football with all those running backs? Nick Saban made it clear that this was Alabama's system. It wasn't a Lane Kiffin, a Steve Sarkisian thing. And so I think that this year it's been about, this is Georgia's system. Mike Bobo implemented it, Todd Monken implemented it. Mike Bobo is continuing it. And I think that run stat really, shows that. Again, 129.5 yards per game through the first 2 weeks last year, 129.0 this year. They actually put up more yards in the opener. Now, again, it was against UT Martin, than they did in a majority of games last year under Monken. And so, I think that they made that clear. This is going to be, Bobo was there. He learned under Monken, what was involved in ways, had a specific role and was, really working on third downs and red zone and stuff like that, and gave advice in ways. And sometimes they used it, sometimes they didn't. That's kind of the analyst's role. But he was there. He saw how it worked. He saw the order of operations per se. And so, he then took that over. Todd Monken was the biggest advocate for Mike Bobo being the one to take it over. When he left, Kirby and him sat down and, Kirby said, hey, what do you think I should do? And Monken essentially said, look, Mike Bobo is the guy. He is, you don't need to go outside. You don't need to bring in outside influences here. Let's keep going what you've got going and use this guy who wants to be at Georgia, has been at Georgia, has had success at Georgia, ignore all the outside noise with it. Mike Bobo is a perfectly capable offensive coordinator. So he certainly has continued to do a lot of the same things that Monken did. This offense is different, though, because you don't have a quarterback who's nearly as mobile in Carson Beck as Stetson Bennett was. You don't have a 6'7" tight end, in Darnell Washington. They've tried to do things, but you can tell losing a guy like that is a huge, huge, huge game changer. And so, you can't do a lot of the same things. Now, they've probably got better wide receivers this year and the depth at that position, adding Ra Thomas and Dominic Lovett from Mississippi State and Missouri, respectively. So, have they gone with a little bit more of open sets and stuff? Absolutely. They haven't run nearly as much 12 personnel, but they haven't been afraid to run 12 personnel. They don't have a back capable of or as proven as Kenny McIntosh was last year out of the backfield and, being an extension of the run game. They've used it some, and they've used, Dylan Bell, who's a wide receiver. They've lined him up in the backfield and thrown the ball to him. They did it with Brock Bowers. They've done it with a walk-on receiver, Mekhi Muse. So they've found ways to keep that same offense going, but they're still figuring it out. And I think that that's the important thing to remember for Georgia through 2 games, is that it is very similar to what we saw last year under Todd Monken, but Mike Bobo's still figuring it out, just like these players are too.
Palmer, you gave us a natural segue there in talking about Mekhi Muse. So punt return for a touchdown to open the scoring against Ball State. His first kickoff return was a good one too. Former walk-on, dangerous player. Kind of
still a walk-on.
For me, yeah, still a walk-on. There you go. and for me, kind of came out of nowhere. I'm sure you guys in Athens were more tuned into it, but I want to, first of all, tell us about him and kind of the genesis there and how dangerous he's looked. But then let's just go special teams in general. This is a couple programs that really prioritize special teams. Kirby Smart talked about it earlier this week. Shane Beamer obviously was on his first staff at Georgia. They know the history. Pete Limbo, South Carolina's been great on special teams. Georgia also literally makes it a third of the game. They don't just say it. Kirby puts starters on special teams. They've got Mekhi Muse. This to me is kind of a storyline to watch, because I think this is, from the South Carolina perspective, Palmer, this is one of the only games that I think you go into maybe being more concerned about the other team's special teams because of, the resources that Georgia devotes to it. So let's hear your take on Muse and special teams matchups for this weekend.
Yeah, Muse has been an exciting storyline so far this season. Like I said, still a walk-on, small guy. I think he's listed at 5'7", and that might be a little bit generous. But he's made plays, and size be damned, he has made those plays, and he took a screen pass 50-something yards for a touchdown in the first game. Had a 69-yard punt return last week. Had a 40-yard kick return that was really good and set Georgia up on that first drive. And so they have used him in special teams offensively. He's a guy that has continued to proved himself on the scout team. And if you're proving yourself on a scout team against Georgia's defense and the guys that they've had out there the last couple of years, you're pretty capable. And so he came onto the scene a little bit during the spring and had a big spring game. He's an effort guy. He totally, puts everything he has into every play he's out there. And, he's certainly made some plays. So he's been an exciting element to the special teams. I think when you look at special teams as a whole for Georgia, like you said, they do put an emphasis on it. They're not afraid to put, multiple starters out there. And that's something that scares a lot of fans. But I think when you watch the game and you watch the tape, it's something that impacts the game. And the way that Georgia has been able to, whether it's a blocked punt here or a kick return there, the blocking has been great on these. And it's because you've got guys that are out there doing it on a down-to-down basis. You've got incredible athletes out there. And so, I do think that it's always an interesting one when you're going up against South Carolina because of that Beamer ball element to it. I think one of my keys to the game for Georgia was be alert, be aware, because Georgia's got a lot more to lose in this one than South Carolina does. And so I would not be surprised. In fact, I would be surprised if Shane didn't have something up his sleeve. I mean, last year it was a fake punt and they converted that. Were there two fake punts? I can't remember. I remember one that got converted and maybe it was another fourth down.
Yeah, I don't remember if there were two. I definitely remember the one. And it was the thing is, Palmer, they've gotten to the point where teams are now alert to it, but they've almost built like layers onto their fakes to where there's like a misdirection element or something as well. So even if you're alert to it,
fake.
Yeah, there's a fake to the fake. So that's they go into every game with those. So absolutely, I think you look at this one, you're shocked when they don't try something, and it doesn't always work, but it's worked more than it hasn't. And I do think, like Chris said, though, that's a concern from a South Carolina side because the games that have been like sort of in the balance, special teams has kind of put them over the top against a lot of teams, whereas against Georgia, you're probably saying, even at the very least from a South Carolina standpoint, it's like even, or maybe even you give Georgia the advantage. Like it's not most games South Carolina goes into and they feel very good about having the special teams advantage just because they put so much emphasis on that part of the game. So definitely something to keep an eye on Saturday. Speaking of that, I was reading over on DawgsHQ. I know you had some players to watch as well. I guess just give us your overall either players to watch or matchups to watch. Where is your head at kind of going into this game? If you're watching at home, where do Gamecock fans need to have their eyes during this matchup?
Yeah, I go to the defensive side of the football because, when you're looking at South Carolina right now and that offense and the way that Spencer Rattler has been, super duper successful early in the season. You look at the back end of Georgia's defense and the secondary being a strength for Georgia. Maybe not having Javon Bullard, that certainly plays a part. And so you're going to keep an eye on David Daniel Sisavon, who's the likely starter in his place. You're going to keep an eye on those other guys that get not bumped up one notch on the depth chart because, when David Daniel's somebody that played in a dime defense, but he wasn't one of their core 4 DBs, or 5 DBs. So, who gets bumped up? Is it a freshman like Janelle Aguero, somebody who's, seen some time back there? Do you move a corner, because they've been rotating a couple of corners? Do you put them on the field because you feel confident in them, in your normal defense? So you should feel good about them in that dime defense. So keeping an eye on that back end, but I think the best way to help the back end is up front, and it's that defensive line. And to me, I mentioned it to you earlier this week. Michael Williams is somebody that I'm watching. I had Warren Brinson as a player to watch. Really, Georgia's play up front. And I think keeping in mind that North Carolina game as the big influence here, the 9 sacks, the 16 tackles for loss. I don't know that Georgia's going to get 9 sacks or 16 tackles for loss, but I think that they are certainly capable of causing some havoc in that backfield. So keeping an eye on those guys up front as well.
Palmer, sticking with the defense, so more big picture here, just for those listening, and I'm curious, I'm going to ask you, where it's only been 2 games, so your answer may be we don't really know yet. Where do you think this defense can by the end of the season once they're in conference play? Where can this stack up versus the past 2 years? The 2021 defense, Georgia, was incredible. 2022 had a huge drop off to where they were giving up 14 points a game or something like that, obviously. But where does this group stack up against those, you think?
It'd be really hard to say that they're going to be that 2021 defense. But I think that they're certainly capable of being 2022, because it's a lot of the same guys that 2022 had. Obviously, you don't have a Jalen Carter out there, and that's a huge factor. You lose a couple of guys, Christopher Smith on the back end. He was a key contributor. Nolan Smith, albeit he got hurt halfway through the season. So you got a little bit of taste of what life without Nolan was like. Keely Ringo on the outside, you feel pretty good about the way that they've replaced him. But, to me, I think that this defense is capable of being, up there with those two. And to even think about having the kind of discussion of, well, where does this defense compare to the 2021 defense, says a lot about the 2023 defense because of what that 2021 defense was. We've seen, there's snapshots of plays from games those years where all 11 of those defenders have been picked in the NFL now. And I think that with this team, you've got a lot of NFL talent players, guys like, and I think that you had that last year, but you've got a little bit more experience on this year's group because you're not replacing 7 guys, you're replacing 4 guys or 5 guys. And so a lot of those guys that are out there this year got a lot of experience last year. They were really good last year. And, the expectation is for them to be just as good, if not better this year, surrounded by a ton of talent and other guys that are taking, steps in the right direction.
Palmer, you've been going for way longer than we requested, man. So we appreciate the time. But final thought from you. I'm guessing we picked Georgia. I'm guessing you're picking Georgia too. So give the Gamecock fans a path. So let's say they play 10 times, Georgia wins 9. What's the path to a South Carolina upset Saturday in Athens?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we said about South Carolina loading the box and taking away Georgia's, run game and not allowing that to get going, forcing Carson Beck to be the guy and him proving to not be the guy. I think that's certainly because of the opponents that Georgia has played so far this season. I think that there's still so much that we don't know about Carson Beck. And so, how does he respond? If he throws an interception, didn't throw any, last season, threw one last week, and it was a tip ball type thing. And so, if he really does make a mistake and it's like, well, that's on you, Carson, how's he going to respond to that? And then I think defensively for Georgia, offensively for South Carolina, it's hitting those big plays. I mean, when you've got the receivers that the Gamecocks do, and you put them in matchups and situations, one-on-one type situations, enough times you're going to hit them a couple of times. And so, you're bound to see some success there. I think that it comes down to protecting Spencer Rattler and letting him get the ball away and forcing that Georgia secondary that has a first-year starter at one of the cornerback spots, could have a first-time starter, likely does have a first-time starter at safety, one who's probably known more for his physicality than his coverage skills, putting those guys in situations that put pressure on them. So it's putting pressure on Carson Beck, and it's putting pressure on Georgia's secondary is the way for South Carolina to keep this one competitive.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better. Again, Palmer, we appreciate the time, man. If you are out there listening or watching, go check out DawgsHQ.com. The beautiful thing about the On3 subscription is if you're a Gamecock Central subscriber, you can go read their message boards, their content. If you're a DawgsHQ subscriber, you can come read our content as well. So whichever side you're on, check out our stuff on Gamecock Central, and certainly check out everything on DawgsHQ as well. Palmer, again, appreciate it, man. Enjoy the game, okay?
Thanks, guys.